Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our translation and the text panel, which I'm delighted to be chairing. I will briefly introduce each speaker, but I don't want to take up too much time. I'll then let all three talks happen, and at the very end, I'll open it up for questions. And I might be a little strict with timekeeping, just so that there will be time for questions. So our very first speaker is Dr. Regis Augustus Bars-Clozel, who's an associate professor at the Universidade Federal de Santa Maria in Brazil. Now he has sent me his bio, but I didn't get it. But I can tell you that he's translated Shakespeare's Book of Sir Thomas More play, and I know that because he did that partly at the Shakespeare Institute. Over to you, Regis.
So thank you very much for the introduction. Let's do it. So firstly, I would like to thank Waseda University, especially on Dr. Jessica Chiba and Professor Tetsuhito Motoyama for their generous invitation for setting up all this beautiful conference that we are having these last 3 days, mostly for their patience in collaboration over the arrangements from traveling from Brazil to Tokyo. So if you are wondering, it took me 44 hours to door to door. And I've been waiting for this deadline for more than 2 years, since 2020, when its first initial version that Jessica was planning. So it's a great honor to be here today with all of you. And secondly, I would like to express that my paper and the ideas on it do reflect my journey studying Shakespeare's textual criticism, mainly on collaboration, and reflect on my experience translating two collaborative plays. So besides Sir Thomas More's translated Arden of Feversham, which is highly more popular with my students than Sir Thomas More is, for obvious reasons, and therefore I'd like to say that I'm not a translation scholar as many of you. So let's do it. So history is a major component in English Renaissance drama. Throughout the 16th century, theater developed in a way that established a fundamental difference to its predecessors, located in what we refer as medieval, Roman, and Greek dramaturgy. This shift was due to the treatment of the historical element. The earliest forms of theater recalled mythical themes and characters, such as the terrible problems of individuals from illustrious, ill-fated families, often referred in Greek tragedies and its Roman versions. In a similar fashion, medieval theater recalled to histories. Okay, I'm really bad at slide sharing. Recalled to histories related to their current understanding of the world composition as their sacred texts and tales had it. These three theater forms share a difference between the times and places depicted in the play in the moment of the audience. They are located in distant ages or even the beginning of the universe. Renaissance drama, on the other hand, reduces significantly this distance and set the action on areas that may even be the neighborhood around the theatrical house. From Gorboduc in the beginning of Elizabethan era in 1559, passing through non-dramatic genres such as the influential Mirror for Magistrates and reaching Caroline plays such as Richard Browne's Jovial Crew 1641, we find times, places, and persons that are closer to the audience in a way that previous drama never have been. Events that are part of their recent histories, such as the rise and fall of Tudor statesmen or favorites, became subjects in plays In the same way as the English famous battles and political decisions, both available in times not so distant. These characters and events are still trackable in memory, a feature impossible for previous dramas. History is often located in early modern English drama as it appears in famous characters, recognizable places, and trackable events. As it progressed, characters that are even more down to earth and familiar situations became standard in the popular Jacobean city plays, which depicted contemporary seasons, practices, and places. History, therefore, as this small overview showed, is a major component from English early modern drama. There is, however, one kind of it that I've not explored yet, but the remaining of my paper will try to address it. The historical aspect that is my focus today, the history of the text. By history of the text, I refer to at least three different units that work together rather than the history that lead to book development. So not the historical, the physical book development, but something else. Firstly, each text has a plot that sets the narrative of events from the beginning to the closure of action. Secondly, there is the textual history, which involves the publication and printing process. Finally, there is the reception history, which involves how readers and the audience reacted to it through time. All these three, plot, textual, and reception, are part of the book history. Editors of Shakespearean plays often engage with these aspects in their introductory material. When translators work with any text, they are also engaging with this. Even their own engagement with a text is part of the book's history of reception, as books that are often well received elsewhere have more chances of reaching new audiences. Hamlet provides a strong case in which all these three aspects are important. The play has an involving plot, featuring madness, ghosts, vengeance, and despair, philosophical inquiry, and death. It also has a problematic textual history, as it exists in three different versions that do differ substantially. Even if one of its versions is considered an inferior one, there are two great ones left. Finally, it's a book extremely well received all around the globe, which is constantly performed, filmed, adapted, and translated. All these factors establish a background for any translating activity in which, if the translator accomplishes successfully the challenge imposed by this enormous Shakespearean text, the resulting translation is automatically part of the history of the text, inheriting the greatness associated to the source text. The importance of Hamlet in Western culture set aside the existence of variants in its textual history, which rarely play a role in any translation. Other examples have stories that, on the other side, set them aside. In the case of William Shakespeare's collaboration with George Wilkins in Pericles, Prince of Charm, 1608, the textual history had a negative effect over the play. According to Susan Gossett in her Arden Shakespeare edition, it was published in a very bad condition in 1609, and an imitative prose version followed by the George Wilkins in the same year. Following its history, it was not even present in the monumental first folio of 1622, and Pericles was only included in the third installment of the folio in 1663, along with 6 other texts by the king's men attached to the first folio appendix. Out of these 7 editions, just Pericles contained Shakespeare's writing. Besides that, it was also a collaborative play with a minor dramatist. All these factors in Pericles' textual history left it aside from many publications, collections, and studies. Although Pericles has incredible plot, is often reliable theatrical performance, and has set the parameters in which Shakespeare navigated through his last creative phase, the romances or late plays. The history of the text has effects on translations. To cover this part, I show as examples in my vernacular language and culture, Brazilian Portuguese. I am basing my data on an up-to-date database about Shakespeare's translations to this specific language called Escolha Seu Shakespeare or Pick Up Your Shakespeare. This database, developed and kept by Professor Marcia Martins, contains detailed information on every translation published in Brazil, keeping a free online register of every new entry. Thus, according to it, there are currently 222 translations of Shakespeare's plays available in the time ranging from 1933 to 2020. Among them, the most translated one is the Tragedy of Hamlet, which appears 16 times over almost a century. Most of these translations are based on the folio texts, and they do reflect how editions were shaped during the moment of translation. There seems to be a tendency that a translation follow the current editorial position and their state of criticism, sometimes with a slightly gap or a slightly later position than the edition. Out of these, 2 are noticeable for my purposes, 2 translations of Hamlet out of these 16 ones. One is José Roberto Schenha translation of the first quarto on the right-hand side. Published in 2020, this was the first time that a specific version of the play reached a translated format, allowing readers to access a play that for some decades remained in the bad quarto position. On this particular quarto, Professor Terry Burrows, in her monograph Young Shakespeare, Young Hamlet 2014, argues that this quarto was written as early as 1589, and that a previous version of Hamlet by someone else, known as the Your Hamlet, is pure scholarly fantasy. The debate on this topic may not be close to a desirable end, but readers can take even the consequences of it, of the realm of the biography level or early productions, early Shakespeare, as well as the reception of the book. Moving to my second example, the one on the left-hand side, there is a specific one that engages with the history of the text, prepared by my colleague at Universidade Federal de Santa Maria, Dr. Lawrence Flores Pereira. His Hamlet was published in 2015 with enormous success and academic appraisal. Lawrence's translation of this Hamlet considers both the second quarto and the folio publication. As the reader goes through the text, it's possible to check through superscripts F's and Q's when a fragment that's only found in the folio or on folio found in the quarto. Thus, the differences of both versions became apparent using just a small visual sign. This practice was inspired by an edition of Shakespeare play, but not inspired by an Hamlet edition. Actually, Lawrence was influenced by Reginald A. Folk's Arden edition of King Lear, published in 1997, who employs superscripts for similar editorial purposes, while mostly based on Harold Jenkins' Hamlet Arden edition 1982, which is a conflated second quarto and first folio. Lawrence highlights verses and blocks of verses that are different from one version to another version. However, as I pointed to him, and he has his own reasons for that, minor variations such as punctuation, vowel words, and other minor elements that are different from the quarto or the folio are not signalized, so he's just paying attention to large variation. On the opposite side of Hamlet and its numerous translations, we find texts that, like Pericles, have a varied story of composition. Along with Henry VIII, Henry VI Part 2, Part 3, tunable kinsmen and Titus Andronicus, Pericles does not feature a high number of translations, counting 5 instances in the same database that we find 16 for Hamlet. Out of these, 4 of these 5 translations of Pericles were part of translation projects that aim to translate everything published by Shakespeare at the current moment. The situation in which that a particular text was covered, the same situation in which a particular text was covered as part of a project happens again with Henry VIII, the plays about Henry VI, Edward III, and historical drama in general. Therefore, Pericles feels like an extra play. The remaining one of this group of 5, published on an individual book by José Roberto Chen in 2012, is the only one that takes the collaborative nature of the play and highlights its textual history. So Pericles is just included as another play that I had to translate, while there is one single play that considers Pericles collaboratively, and it's an individual translation. There is a pattern in these numbers. Texts that do not belong to the first folio editions, such as Tunable's Kinsman and Pericles, are not frequently translated, at least during the 20th century, or outside wider range translation projects. However, plays are the ones about Henry VI, Henry VIII, and titles face the same translation situation, but they are actually found in the first folio. If we consider only the textual history, these plays are all collaborations between Shakespeare and someone else. If we consider the plot, they may be too restricted for an audience set in a different time and geography. If we consider the reception of them, they are far from being the most performed, adapted, or read ones. The history of the text as a connection of plot, publication, and reception may have something to do with the number of times it gets enough attention to receive a vernacular version. In this respect, Hamlet and Pericles vary immensely, as they do have different numbers of translations. Collaborative plays, however, have been a constant focus of scholarly attention in the 21st century. In the last years, collections such as the New Oxford Shakespeare IC collaborative plays and London Shakespeare have granted them a space that these texts have never seen before. It was during these years that my 2 translations of Shakespeare's collaborative plays, Sir Thomas More and Adam of Faversham, were concluded. In a similar way to Lawrence Flores Pereira and Reginald Folks, I will use superscripts to highlight different parts of the texts. Superscripts is also the technique used by Professor John Jowett, who edited Sir Thomas More 2011 for Art and Shakespeare, and it was my co-advisor. It was co-devising my work during my academic visitorship at the Shakespeare Institute. Sir Thomas More is a text by 6 different dramatists, subject to revisions and censorship. It was never published and remained in manuscript format. Therefore, it has a rich textual history as well as a rich compositional history that I try to highlight, not focusing only on alternative versions, but also on internal revision. This same approach, but in a lesser degree of complexity, was applied to my translation of Arden of Feversham, a tragedy that features in its complete version in the New Oxford Shakespeare in 2016 and has received scholarly attention over the years in both monographic studies and editions. So to conclude, during the process of translation, translators have to engage directly with the textual history. By relying on an edition, the translated text refers to the current state of textual criticism, as the translator needs to rely on one text as a guide for problematic passages or for alternative versions, as in the case of Hamlet. Relying on editorial criticism, translators can assign to the reader other elements present in the text, such as internal revision, censorship, or variance, as in the case of Sir Thomas More. Checking current authorial attribution, translators can point to the reader where a text possibly shifts from one author to another, as in the case of Arden of Feversham. Verifying the publication history, translators can address to readers how that particular text was treated and read, as in the case of Pericles. Engaging with translation of texts that have long histories is much more than face the difficulties of early modern text and its linguistics particularities over the development of the plot. The nature of the text and the critical reception are important elements to consider. Their presence is mostly in the background information, how the text has reached a point in which a translation is possible. However, current information and discussions, like scholarly or editorial information, also play a role in shaping the decisions around the translation process. Quantitative analysis point to substantial difference in the history of the text, not only limited to the plot, but also reinforced by elements of its reception and textual background. To conclude, in a wider perspective, the history of the text may lead to the conditions that enable a translation to exist. But once it's completed, the resulting vernacular text becomes one more chapter within it. So these are my few references on collaboration. Muito obrigado pela atenção. Obrigado gozaimasu.
Thank you so much. As I say, we'll have questions afterwards. I'd just like to introduce now Hyerin Shin, a PhD student at the Graduate School of Letters, Arts and Sciences here at Waseda University. Her interests include early Shakespeare translations in East Asia, the theory of play, and video games. Thank you.
promised the video in part is actually relevant because I'm going to talk about people playing the play. Anyways, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for granting me a chance to meet with all these wonderful people and present Korean translations of Shakespeare in front of everyone. Well, not everyone, but yeah. Anyway, so the play on stage, translations of Julius Caesar in the early 20th century Korea as utopian play. Okay, so I think we need some background knowledge first, because I'm assuming no one here really knows about Korean translations of Shakespeare. And I'm assuming no one speaks Korean either, unless you're a big K-pop fan or something. So, Shakespeare in Korea. The first ever mention of the name Shakespeare was in 1906. This name appeared in the second issue of the magazine called Soyangbo, and it appears in the partial translation of Samuel Small's Self-Help. So this magazine, Soyangbo, was one of the first modern magazines in Korea. It was published under the official permit from the Korean government, which in 1906 at the time was this unfortunately short-lived Korean Empire, but only the Koreans called it like that. So this magazine was trying to introduce culture, history, literature, and news from all around the world to the Korean people. So here, Shakespeare's name was spelled Seigusuya. This is probably a transliteration of the Chinese characters that were used to write his name, but it's interesting that he's introduced here as the greatest and most magnificent among the English thinkers. So he's a thinker, not a writer or even a playwright. And a bit later, during the next decade, he started to be introduced as a literary figure or a playwright. And you often have the name and quotes from his works appearing in textbooks, books on Western history and culture, and magazines, both for students, usually for students, things like Sonyeon, like shonen in Japanese, or Tomyeon, like seinen. So one of these such mentions include this one by Chen Namson, who was one of the most influential intellectuals at the time, who listed Shakespeare's Hamlet among the 3 most treasured books, alongside the Iliad and Don Quixote. I have compiled a brief, well, not very brief, a table that summarizes the history of early Shakespeare performances and translations. Obviously, I didn't have time to go through all of them, sadly. But first, the performances. The most notable thing about early Korean performances were that the amateur performances performers were the most prolific ones. So you have over here, you have the Keijo Commercial High School Drama Club. Keijo was the old Japanese colonial name for Seoul. So as a high school drama club playing Shakespeare's plays, but they played in English. They didn't use a Korean translated script. And for the professional performances, they were done by Japanese theater troops in Japanese in the early days to commemorate the Japanese victory against Russia, but in Korea. And you have the one by the Merchant of Venice, only the trial scene by the Research Society for Performing Arts, but they were also organized by Korean students in Tokyo. And as for the translations, so here I actually have 2 pages. Anyways, for the translations, I want to highlight that, so the actual full translations of the plays are pretty rare in Korea. I think we only have like one that's Hamlet, which was retranslated from Shoyo's translation, Japanese translation. And the other translations of the plays are the Julius Caesar that I'm going to talk about, and a couple of Merchant of Venice. And the more popular popular way of translating Shakespeare was translating from Land's tales from Shakespeare, and they were often marketed as novels. For example, 1927 Hamlet, you can see here, was retitled as The Maiden Ophelia of Great Romance, 영작 로맨스 Ophelia 처녀. So, I mean, yeah, so it's a Irish version of Hamlet that, I mean, I guess you can see where the focus lies here. And if you look at all the other translations, like the Merchant of Venice one, they were called like the human flesh trial. So they were supposed to be more like focused on like storytelling, this new shiny thing from this Western lands, and it's so sensational. They're having a trial with their human flesh kind of thing. Okay, so to today's topic proper, the two translations of Julius Caesar. So why am I talking about Julius Caesar? So they were like the first actual translated play of Shakespeare in Korea. And what I mean by actual translation is that beyond like just quoting Shakespeare or mentioning titles, this was like, it's partial, but it was like first instance of kind of like longer full text being translated. So the first translation of Julius Caesar was called The Speech of Brutus. Brutus의 웅변. So just to note that all the Korean used here, like it's actually supposed to be older Korean, but I modernized them because of the font compatibility problem. So sorry for that. So this translation appears in this third issue of the magazine called Lux Gentiae. This was the official Latin title. The Korean name was called Hakjigwang. This was the magazine published by the Association of Korean Students in Tokyo, called Hague. And this part has a bit of overlap with the first, the panel we had on the first day of the conference, the post-colonial Shakespeare. Because this group, and by extension the magazine, had a quite complex relationship with Imperial Japan. The group developed the Korean national identity and the basis for opposing the colonial rule with the knowledge they learned in Japan, at the capital of their colonizers in Tokyo. So these elite students also got inspiration from the Taisho democracy movements, and they became the ideological basis for the operation of the Korean provisional government in Shanghai, who tried to resist the colonial rule both politically and through military operations in Manchuria. But at the same time, they obviously faced a lot of limitations, because from the records you can see that they were closely monitored and manipulated by the police. Like, this was facilitated by the members of the group who were like impoverished students in most of the cases, selling out the group's info to the police in exchange for money. So the official stance of the magazine ended up being that it was to be a cultural and literary magazine, and any overt discussion of current politics were banned. And the magazine it did face like the cancellation of publication for 2 years, so it made sense for them to do this. And our translator for the first translation was named Jong-Mo-sik, but it's hard to find information on him. I couldn't even find a picture. He's most well known as the author of Joseon Samguksa, the history of Joseon opera, which chronicled the history of the traditional Joseon musical storytelling performance called Pansori. He studied politics and economics at Meiji University, and he was one of the 44 national representatives at the March 1st demonstration movement in 1919. And the reason why we don't know much about him is that he eventually moved to North Korea after the Korean War. And yeah, he was probably an important person there because his death was reported. But beyond that, we don't really know much. I have a picture of, this is what his translation of Julius Caesar, or more specifically, the speech of Brutus, looks like. Only 2 pages. And like even if you cannot speak Korean, there's some things that are like immediately visible from here. So this is a partial translation of Act 3, Scene 2, lines 13 to 39 of the original text. This was likely influenced by Japanese translations, although I've compared it with Kawashima Keito and Tsuboto Shoyo's translation, and it's not a complete retranslation. But the influence is quite obvious in, for example, the way the characters' names are spelled. So Caesar is spelled Shisa, so it really resembles the Japanese Shiza, compared to the modern Korean spelling, which is Shizo, more close to the English pronunciation. So this translation doesn't look like a play at all. So it's transformed into a speech. I mean, it is called the speech of Brutus after all. So the translator's notes, from the translator's notes, he makes clear that his intention is that this was to serve as an example of an excellent speech that people can learn from, not, as a play or anything, but an example of great rhetoric. You can learn from Brutus. They're one of the examples of how the text was transformed. The part highlighted in red, there the parts changed in the Korean translations. So here, so you don't have any mention of the speakers or the stage directions. And the playlines lines are all deleted. So you have in the original saying all going non, Brutus non. But here, Brutus just keeps making his speech, like as a rhetorician, uninterrupted speech. So instead of having the plebeians say their lines, Brutus just like checks the crowd supposedly and say like, the red part. And it's like, oh yeah, there's no such person, instead of non being said by other characters. And he continues on with this whole speech. Okay. The second one. The second one was called Julius Caesar in 1926 in Korean, Julius Caesar. This is also a translation of Act 3, Scene 2 of the original, minus the very last part where the servant enters. It actually ends at the line 251, take the what horse thou wilt. This was published on the New Year's issue of the newspaper, 동아일보, it's still around, where it is mistakenly titled Julius Caesar Act 2, Scene 3. Translator's notes is also included there. So he says he tried his best to translate the rhythm of the original too, and he hopes it would make the readers interested in the part of this great English genius. So it calls back to like how in the beginning Shakespeare was introduced as a symbol of like this part of great Western thinkers and like culture. So this is our translator, Lee Wang-soo. He was one of the most influential cultural figures in colonial Korea. He was like a best-selling author, a best-selling translator. And his contributions are beyond that, because his novels and translations address the diaglossia, the Korean language. Like he helped shape the modern Korean language. He pushed for the agreement of the written and spoken language and community, because before this, like upper class, Hangul was developed in the 15th century, but the upper class and the official documents still used Chinese writing while speaking Korean, and Hangul was considered the language of the lower class and women and was looked down at. So he helped solve that problem, and now we all use Hangul. So he studied philosophy here at Waseda University. He was part of the Korean provisional government later, but he eventually became a really notorious collaborator of the colonial regime. I'm talking about like being a fascist and like convincing people to throw down their lives for the Japanese emperor kind of thing. So this is how the translation appeared in the newspaper page. Julius Caesar on there, up over there, the title. So he uses repetition as the main method that creates a sense of rhythm, because I think we can all agree that it's impossible to replicate the rhythm in the original English language into other languages, especially Korean, which is really different. So I have the most obvious example here. So even if you don't speak Korean, you'll see how it looks really similar, like the word endings. So the shio ending is used continuously throughout the translation in both Brutus and Mark Antony's speeches. It also simplifies the diction of the original text. So you have all these expressions in the original that talks about killing Caesar, like rose again. He rose against Caesar, he died, he slew Caesar. But in Korean, it's all condensed into 죽이다 or 죽다, just kill. And this kind of simplification is pretty striking in the previous lines. So see, again, even if you don't read Korean, you see how it looks really similar. It'll start with 브루터스를 계산한 모양으로 집에 보내자. 브루터스와 그 조상의 비를 세우자. 브루터스로 시설을 삼자. So, through this kind of simplification, the plebeians appear much more simple-minded and easily swayed, and the speaker's impact on the plebeians is dramatically emphasized. So again, it goes back to the translators, the intention appearing in translators' notes, that if his translation can interest readers in the part of great English genius spirit, so to make the translation work better as a symbol of the Western culture, through which the readers can learn the West, and is intended for a mass audience like newspaper readers. So this kind of simplification was necessary. And yeah, actually I'm running out of time. So this is also reminiscent of the closet drama, especially considering that the closet drama is often studied in the context of privacy in opposition to the public pressure, and also in regards to education, especially for more marginalized classes like women. And I would argue that this translation, although it more closely resembles the original, is not still fully adequate to be performed on stage, and there's in fact no record of it having ever been actually being ever performed. Like there's the list of characters is not comprehensive. He's missing quite a few stage directions, and obviously it cuts off the last part. There's no context as to what the rest of the story is. And yeah, this translator, Lee-Kwang-soo, he had a kind of statement that attempts to define literature, like this Western concept, literature, 문학, as in the translation of literature, instead of the traditional study, the literary studies. Here, play, he separates, so in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how the performances and the translations they kind of existed separately, right? So this, again, goes back to that. So when one talks about drama as a form of literature, it refers to the play script that has been composed to be acted up on stage. But then he goes on to say, play, which refers to the performance that acts out the script, is an art form separate from literature. That's what he thinks, and it's reflected in his translation. So why aren't they playing the play? Sorry for the terrible here. To address that question, I go to the theory of play by Huizinga in Homo Ludens. The main point that I want to address here is that inside the playground, an absolute and peculiar order reigns. Here we come across another very positive feature of play. It creates order, it is ordered, into an imperfect world and into the confusion of life. It brings a temporary, a limited perfection. Play demands order, absolute and supreme. So play is its own thing. It takes place in a separate space that's ruled by its own set of rules. And building on this, Alexander Galloway argues that the ability to selectively simulate certain rules is the most important scaffolding in utopia. When you're playing on the stage, you decide, like, each rule by a specific set of rules, and you get to decide what those rules are going to be. So the translations are now unbound by the rules of the original text. The original play, they're no longer concerned with the performance. So now we're even questioning the rules of play itself, because there's no stage, and therefore there's no spatial distinction that separates the playground, the magic circle, with the ordinary life. This is because the translators aim to use Shakespeare plays for utilitarian purposes, that enlightening the Korean population. So this has to be more directly relevant to your ordinary life, and therefore the secludedness of the play must be removed. So this is why I titled my presentation the Utopian Play. These translations are utopian texts because A, the translators strive for the enlightenment of the readers and a better society through the translation. So this is an ideal utopian vision of Korea that they wanted to create. But also because there is no stage in this translation. It's like a closet drama, a play that is intended not to be played, and therefore no separate space for the play. So, yeah. The play is unreal, but these translators wanted the plays to make an impact on the real life, and thus the boundary between the magic circle of the play and the ordinary life must be broken down in this translation. Thank you.
Thanks for a second fascinating talk. I'd now like to introduce Makiko Kawano, a research associate and PhD student in the Graduate School of Arts and Letters at Meiji University in Tokyo. She has MAs from Exeter and Tokyo Metropolitan University. Her research interests include adaptations of Shakespeare and the representation of female characters in Japan in the early 20th century. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for coming here, and thanks for the conference to inviting me. And okay, so my title is Ophelia, Something to Go. So Ophelia's pure image supported by the translations of the first ballad with a negative word in modern Japan. So, okay. This paper will consider how the translations of Ophelia's first part in Hamlet Act 4 Scene 5, which is regarded as a variant of Walsingham ballad, without the negative word reinforce the interpretations of Ophelia as a pure and obedient virgin in Japan during the 20th century. So, there has been heated discussion about the lyrics. From the late 19th century to the early 20th century, a lot of editors chose did go instead of did not go in the stanza of Ophelia's first ballad. So maybe some time to hear the music. translated into did go. So originally, this stanza, third stanza, contains a negative word in Polio and quote of Hamlet. However, in 1725, Alexander Pope omitted this note and accepted did go in his edition without any notes. This emendation had been inherited until the 20th century, although there was some criticism and doubt whether Pope's argument was correct or not. This editorial background had influenced on Japanese translations during the Meiji Taisho period, which was from 1868 to 1926, because many Japanese translators used editions which accepted did go as source books. However, Japanese translators had been accepting did go even after John Dover Wilson published his edition in 1934, which insists on did not go. After Wilson, more editors began to accept did not go, but several editions omitting not had been reprinted until the 1960s. In 1966, Lucy Bate discussed whether Ophelia thinks did go or did not go. Bate summarized a historical controversy about this omission. According to her discussion, some scholars did not agree with did go, but most editors followed did go. And she argued that the editors, quote, debated only who was responsible for the error, end quote. Bate herself affirms did not go, suggesting the possibility that there was, quote, an error in the line division, end quote. As long as I could see the published text of Hamlet after Bates' discussion, it seems that the 1960s was a turning point to accept did not go. In the same year as Bates' discussion was published, a Japanese translation with did not go was published for the first time, and the translator was Oyama Toshikazu. Here is the third stanza of his translation. After Oyama, also some new translators wrote did not go. Many productions still use did go. And the representative translation by Tsunari Fukuda in 1955 and by Yushio Dashima in 1983. After Kazuko Matsuoka published her translation in 1996, all translators start to accept did not go. However, this paper mainly focuses on the translation published during the 20th century and does not discuss after the 1990s. So here only the canon, and I would like to discuss the translations published after 1990s at another time. So now 2 questions have arisen. Why did it take so much time to accept did not go in Japan, even though many translators referred to the editions which deny Pope's emendation of this negative word? How did the translations which omit the negative word influence the image of Ophelia? In this paper, I will divide the history of Japanese translation of Ophelia's first work into 2 periods, before World War II and after World War II, and investigate these questions at each section. So, in Meiji Japan, Ogai Mori was the first person who introduced Ophelia's ballad to Japan. He translated Ophelia's first ballad alone with the title Ofu Eria no Uta, Ophelia's Song, in 1889. In his translation, Ophelia sings did go, so home rinu in Japanese, and this pattern would be succeeded in most Japanese translations of Hamlet. Yeah, all of them translated did go. And as I have already mentioned, although the Huayan and the court contain not, and some researchers such as Edward Jordan and John Wilson proposed an oppositional idea from Pope's interpretation about omitting the note. Pope's emendation continued to be dominant until the 1950s. Next presentations. And therefore, most previously published texts of Hamlet, which were imported to Japan in the early 20th century, adopted this goal. According to Shigetoshi Kawatake, in the early 20th century, Katsuo's and Dayton's editions were popular among Japanese students. Both versions omitted not and adopted did go without any footnote about this emendation. This indicates that many editions of Hamlet which Japanese people could easily get followed Pope's interpretation. Following this trend, it seems natural that Japanese translators accepted Ophelia's first ballad without the negative word. However, several translators refer to the edition with footnotes which explain that in the Shakespeare's original text, Ophelia sings did not go. For instance, Koya Tozawa and Hyoki Asano mentioned Edward Doden's edition, in which Doden denied Pope's emendation. Shoyo Tsuboji's use of New Variant edition edited by Horace Howard Shaw Parnes, which had a long footnote about the discussion about which the use did or did not go. Shoyo wrote down his idea of translation or paraphrastic expression on the Valorem edition, which Enpaku owns now. Looking over his handwriting, third stanza was rephrased. The shroud, quotes, the shroud of him who went to his grave bewept with showers of tears by his faithful lovers, end quote. This shows that Shoyo selected this goal following Parnes' edition. Shoyo also referred to Sanki Ichikawa's English edition in 1922. After World War II, when Ichikawa republished it, Ichikawa explained that he had checked Wilson's note, in which Wilson argues that, quote, "An unmetrical note would direct the attention of the audience to her wandering," end quote. Later, Ichikawa published his own translation in 1968 with Kaiichi Matsuura. In that translation, Ichikawa wrote that he referred to the previous translation by Torajiro Sawamura besides Shoyo's. Although Sawamura referred to Wilson, Sawamura had accepted this goal in Japanese nobe no okuri, that is directly meaning the funeral is much more direct meaning, as well as Shoyo's, so probably Ichikawa also followed this tradition. So the tradition of omitting not in Japanese translations seems to influence the image of Ophelia as a pure and obedient maiden who lost her mind because of her tragic privations of her father and lover. Then, I will see the interpretation of Ophelia in Japan in the early 20th century. In the late 19th century, some feminists started to analyze the character of Ophelia in the West. These interpretations were introduced to Japan almost at the same time. For instance, Shakespeare's heroines' characteristics of women moral, critical, and historical written by Anna Boyle Jameson in 1832 was translated on Jogaku Zashi, a magazine for schoolgirls, in 1894. Jameson analyzes that Ophelia, quote, is so young that neither her mind nor her person have attained maturity, end quote. Moreover, she describes Ophelia's madness as, quote, what an astonishing picture of a mind utterly, hopelessly wrecked, end quote. Yusetsu translated this a mind as otome gokoro, a maid mind. This word choice of translation seems to help to regard Ophelia as a premature and pure virgin, because otome in Japanese is defined as a pre-adult and unmarried woman. Japanese people generally share such Ophelia's marginal image, although some interpreted Ophelia's relationship with Hamlet in a sexual light, as suggested by Ludwig Tieck and others. However, this interpretation seems to be ignored in Japan. For example, 1910, Genkichi Hirata denied the interpretations that Ophelia had a sexual intercourse and argued that her years and kind spirit could not endure the killing her father by her lover. Thus, the translators and the leaders in Meiji Taisho Japan idolized Ophelia as a pure maiden, denying her sexual allure. In 1918, just before his Hamlet was staged, Shiko Tsuboji, a nephew and once an adopted son of Shoyo Tsuboji, describes Ophelia as a naive and immature virgin, and she is honest and obedient like Eastern women, which indicates that the characterization of Ophelia in Japan was related to the ideal Japanese women who were submissive and virtuous. Similarly, Shoyo Tsuboji described Ophelia as an innocent, cheerful, pure, obedient, and lovely maiden in the following year when he published his translation. Furthermore, this image of Ophelia's was strengthened on the stage or novel adaptations. For example, Ophelia's second part, which may intimidate sexual relationships, was usually cut on stage. According to Yoshika Miura, in his novel adaptation of Hamlet for Girls, Sakuragi Kurenji cut the lines which indicate Ophelia's mourn for her father. Miura argues that this cut weakened the aggression of her madness, and her madness is reformed, more controllable. This modification of Ophelia's lines contributes to consolidate her image as a pure and obedient maiden. Adding to these modifications, the translation of Did Go also helps to strengthen Ophelia's pure image. As many editors have explained, Did Not Go expresses Ophelia's incoherent mind during her madness. In the recent research like Haruo Nakano, this negative word works as a criticism of patriarchy for Elizabethan audience. Conversely, Did Go helps to depict Ophelia as a dutiful daughter who places a wreath on her father's grave with tears even if she is mad. Thus, mad Ophelia still has an obedient and affectionate image. Her madness now becomes controllable, and therefore this ballad does not work as a criticism, but presents the image of an unfortunate girl who could not bear under her misfortune in the Danish establishment. All in all, there are two possible reasons why Japanese translators chose Did Go rather than Did Not Go before World War II. First, a lot of the editions which translators and scholars referred to followed Pope's omission of this negative word, and the discussion of this amendation was not yet settled. Second, they seem to keep the image of Ophelia as a pure and obedient maiden. So now, I'd like to move to the next question. Why did Japanese translators continue to accept Did Go after World War II, when Wilson's edition became popular? So the Japanese translation of Ophelia's first part after World War II. So some Japanese Hamlet and the bilingual editions published just after World War II, that's the list, and these were reprinted versions whose first editions were published until the 1930s. Furthermore, these translators were familiar with Ophelia's first ballad translated by Ogai or Shoyo during Meiji Taisho period. Gintaro Fukuhara reminisces that one old scholar of German literature told that he could not stop tears when he watched Ophelia on stage. And Fukuhara guesses that Hamlet was also a play of pitiful Ophelia for young literary enthusiasts in Meiji era. To support this view, Fukuhara introduced Tokoku Kitamura's episode that he performed Mad Ophelia when he stayed at a hotel with his friends. Female students also loved Ophelia's first ballad, as Soma Kuromitsu wrote. It is guessed that the translation readers who grew up in this mood had a firm image of the madness of Ophelia as an innocent girl, which Kazuogawa described her in 1947, and therefore they probably did not change their translation after they read Wilson's edition. So this tendency is also observed in Tsuneyari Fukuda. Fukuda followed this tradition of adapting did go in his translation. So here is Fukuda's translation. And even though Fukuda depended on Wilson's edition, however, we may have to consider the fact that some Western productions, which probably Fukuda had watched before he translated and directed his own Hamlet in 1955, still accept did go. For instance, Sir Lawrence Olivier selected did go in his film in 1948. This example shows that it is probably an ordinary thing that Ophelia sang did go on stage or in a film until the 1950s, even though researchers had already discussed Pope's emendation of this note. Therefore, Fukuda seems to have chosen did go following these productions rather than following Wilson's footnote. In addition to English text and productions, Fukuda wrote that Shoyo's translation was particularly helpful. Fukuda especially referred to Shoyo's rhythm and not to Ophelia's ballad. However, for Fukuda, Shoyo's translation was still unknown. After Fukuda, Toshikazu Oyama published his translation in 1966. So his translation is here. And he was the first translator who accepted did not go. In his footnote, Oyama explains this negative word works as a sign of mad Ophelia's sanity following some traditional explanations such as Dogen's. However, not all the translators after Oyama have accepted did not go. Although Reiji Nagakawa and Junji Kinoshita followed Oyama, Yushi Odashima accepted did go. His translation is one of the most popular editions for the stage productions in present-day Japan. So here is his translation. So here, the right side is a 1983 translation. So here, Odashima translates a play into Nonotsuchi, the Soul of Land, and he interpreted that true love showers fall into the land. However, this translation of the play was different from Odashima's first translation, published as a stage script for Bungakuza on Shingeki magazine in 1972, the left side. So in this translation, Odashima replaced the play with a pale complexion, but true love showers still convey on the face. Norio Deguchi added his annotation to Odashima's stage script. Deguchi wrote that Ophelia does not lose her mind of devotion even in her madness. It seems that the tradition that Ophelia is regarded as an obedient maiden was still alive in the 1972 Japanese theater world. Hence, it is still popular that she sang did go in Japanese translation after World War II. In summary, there are three possible reasons why did go was still dominant in Japanese translations and had taken time until Did Not Go became common after World War II. First, many translators may have inherited the doctrine of Ophelia, which was introduced and accepted in the early 20th century. Second, they probably followed the theater and film productions in the Western countries, which accepted Did Go. Lastly, Japanese people still strongly thought of Ophelia as a pure and obedient maiden. After Gashima translators such as Kazuko Matsuoka selected Did Not Go in the rendition of Ophelia's ballad, this is because the editors whose text the translators referred to made the same choice following the folio and quote. And probably because the Japanese audience start to accept the different image of Ophelia. The quickly conclusion. This paper discussed how the translations of Ophelia's first ballad without the negative word was dominant, and how this custom enforced the interpretations of Ophelia as a pure and obedient version in Japan during the 20th century. In the first phase of the translation of Ophelia's first ballad, the most English text which Japanese could easily get followed box emendation. Furthermore, since the translations which accepted the goal became popular among the young people at that time, it might be suggested that the translator's attitude to accept the negative word was surpassed by the atmosphere. In addition, Japanese readers usually idealize Ophelia as a pure, obedient, and perfect girl in Meiji Taisho periods. This characterization of Ophelia coincides with the ideal Japanese women who were submissive and virtuous. Therefore, by translating Did Go, Ophelia could be depicted as a dutiful daughter who shows her love to her dead father even if she becomes mad, which reminds Japanese audience and readers at the time of the ideal relationship between father and daughter. In the later phase, the translations were first either reprinted versions or the new translation by translators who published a bilingual text or an annotated edition. Accordingly, these translations follow the interpretations of Ophelia or the translations published before World War II. Therefore, it took a time for Japanese translations to adapt Did Not Go. Besides, Western production also accepted Did Go for a while after World War II, and the Japanese translations probably followed this custom. Additionally, the obedient and pure image of Ophelia was still shared among Japanese translators and readers. So it seems to be natural to let her sing Did Go to the grave in order not to hurt her image. As a result, Ophelia continued to sing Did Go until recently in Japan. It may lead to the production of her original image to select Did Go. Moreover, to keep this characterization of Ophelia, translators may have possibly not dared to translate the negative word which was difficult for them to explain. Thank you for kind attention.
So thank you for the 3 excellent talks. As you know, this panel is called Translation Under the Text, but I think what all the talks have taught us is that there's a real problem about what the text is, and how you interpret the text then changes what you take Shakespeare to be. I'm so sorry that we are out of time, we're over time, so I'm not going to take questions now. I'm going instead to ask you to ask your questions to our wonderful speakers outside, but I would like to thank you once more for 3 enlightening papers. Thank you.